Welcome back to Free Speech Nation. You don't have to be a qualified historian to know that tyrannies usually begin with the implementation of censorship, whether that's against freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, or freedom of speech. Tyrants are threatened by free speech because it is the means by which their corruption is exposed. Sometimes they'll impose censorship on the grounds that it's in the interest of the public. Maybe there's a terrorist threat or a war or subversive ideological elements that are stirring up trouble. Under such circumstances, governments give themselves what they call emergency powers, or they restrict certain freedoms on the grounds that such measures are only temporary. Sometimes these temporary measures last an awfully long time. And this week, one of those terrible events occurred that can so often lead to calls for censorship. In Colorado, there was a horrific massacre at a gay bar. 5 people were killed and many more were injured. A writer for the New York Times claimed that this massacre happened because conservatives had been voicing their opposition to drag shows for children. According to the author, the likes of Matt Walsh and Ron DeSantis have fostered, quote, escalating anti-gay and anti-trans violence. Many others joined in with the predictable chorus. The writer Chris Rufo was blamed for the attacks because he had exposed evidence to the public of the indoctrination of queer theory in American schools. The Twitter account Libs of TikTok was blamed for the attack simply for reposting footage of hypersexualized drag shows with children in attendance, as though simply letting people know that this was going on was somehow worse than the events themselves. Over at NBC, one commentator said, there is a pipeline. It starts from some smaller accounts online, like Libs of TikTok. It moves to the right-wing blogosphere, and then it ends up on Tucker Carlson, or it ends up in a right-wing politician's mouth. It's a dangerous cycle, and it does have real-world consequences. We've been here before, haven't we? Whenever there's a senseless tragedy of this kind, people understandably try to find a reason why, and they often end up pointing the finger of blame in the wrong direction. So when a man started shooting cinema-goers in Colorado in 2012 during a screening of The Dark Knight Rises, many people blamed the films that he had been watching. When a psychopath in Norway shot dead 70 people on an island in 2011, commentators in the media were quick to blame some of the public figures that the killer had named in his so-called manifesto. In March 2019, 51 Muslim worshippers were murdered by a terrorist in New Zealand, and all kinds of blame games began. One Australian senator said it was due to Muslim immigration. A US commentator blamed Fox News. A protester in New York harangued Chelsea Clinton and said that the attack had been stoked by people like her. It's almost as though we wanted to blame anyone but the culprit. And then came the inevitable acts of censorship. A chain of bookstores in New Zealand stopped selling Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, on the supposition that it had inspired the killer, which is a conclusion you could only reach if you hadn't read it. The New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, enacted heavy-handed internet censorship, which even extended to online discussions about the shooting. And look at what happened in this country after the horrific murder of the MP David Amess. MPs called for a new law to crack down on internet trolls. David's Law, they called it, even though the killing had nothing to do with online trolls. It was committed by a fundamentalist Islamic extremist. In other words, a tragedy was being used to justify a policy of censorship that had got nothing to do with the murder itself. And the same has happened with this appalling incident at a gay bar in Colorado. In the coverage of the shooting, the Pink News had made the following claim. The trans community has faced an onslaught of anti-LGBTQ+ bills in America just this year, with some states banning gender-affirming care for minors. And the article goes on to quote Sarah Kate Ellis, President and CEO of the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, who says, you can draw a straight line from the false and vile rhetoric about LGBTQ people spread by extremists and amplified across social media, to the nearly 300 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced this year, to the dozens of attacks on our community like this one. So if you believe, as most people do, that gender-affirming care is a terrible idea, or that gender identity ideology is damaging for the rights of women and gay people, you are somehow responsible for this kind of senseless violence. As Tom Slater put it in an article for Spike this week, shut up or people will die is the take-home message here. And we've already seen activists blaming Elon Musk for allowing previously banned right-wing accounts to return to Twitter. Apparently, censorship is the only way to stop any future atrocities of the kind we saw in Colorado. And everyone seems to be blaming their political opponents. How convenient. Well, perhaps everyone should have waited a little bit before assuming they knew the motives of the attack. It turns out that the murderer identifies as non-binary, with they-them pronouns. So the theory that this is a straightforwardly transphobic attack may not stack up after all. And some activists have even said, well, they don't believe him. He's just pretending to identify as non-binary to further demonise the LGBT community. And these are the same people who 5 minutes ago were claiming that there was never any risk of criminals exploiting gender self-identification for their own ends. Oh well, so much for that theory. The truth is, we just don't know why this man committed these evil deeds. It's always better to wait until we can be certain of the facts. But so many people jumped at the chance to exploit the killings as a cudgel to beat their opponents. And this is grim stuff. And of course, people are free to blame whoever they want, but it's our responsibility to criticise those who do so, to point out that they are not just analytically wrong, but morally wrong. The person to blame for the horrific murders in Colorado was the man with the gun, not those who have concerns about the ideological indoctrination of children or the frequency of hypersexualised drag shows for kids, or those who have reservations about gay marriage. These are debates that we need to be able to have without people dismissing them as incitement to murder. There's even a term for it now. You may have heard it: stochastic terrorism. This is the idea that views that are offensive to certain groups necessarily lead to real-world violence. So, if you argue that it's wrong for small children to be taught that there are over 100 genders, and then someone commits a crime against a trans person, that's your fault. You're a stochastic terrorist. And this is a very sinister development. We've had activists claim that words are violence for a long time now, but they've moved on. Words are now terrorism. And it's a small step from here to demanding that such words are silenced completely. And this is why I mention the tactic of tyrants, who claim that there is an existential threat to society that requires emergency powers to enact censorship. If certain opinions are terroristic, surely they shouldn't be aired. But this is a ruse, a way to narrow the Overton window, to prevent discussion and debate about important issues. It's an authoritarian trick, and it's simply wrong. We've had 6 decades of research into media effects theories, and it's provided no secure evidence of a general correlation between public behaviour and mass media consumption. And the direct effects model has been comprehensively discredited. So the evidence is in. People simply don't act on cue by the words they hear in the media. And discussion of sensitive topics is not incitement to violence. For all the claims that Conservatives are responsible for mass murder, no mainstream politician of any political stripe was anything other than horrified by the attack in Colorado, and it is unfair to pretend otherwise. And the thing is, I do understand why people reach so desperately for these false conclusions. We all find these incidents unfathomable. Emotions are running really high, and so, of course, people will resort to simplistic explanations for these inexplicable things. We can't possibly understand the mindset of this kind of evil, so if we can just point to a controversial commentator and say it's his or her fault, we can somehow resolve it. Suddenly it all makes sense. But of course life is messy, far more complicated than that. When the murderer of John Lennon claimed that he had been inspired by J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye, should we have taken him seriously? Was Salinger really responsible for Lennon's death? Should every copy have been banned? Of course not. So in all these difficult discussions, we need to be wary of those who think that censorship is the answer, or who think their political opponents ought to be silenced. Stochastic terrorism isn't a thing. It's like that phrase, dog whistle, when your opponent hasn't said the thing you wanted them to say, so you accuse them of implying it or secretly thinking it. These are just tricks to shut down debate, to foster a climate in which censorship becomes the norm. And that way, tyranny lies.